In Hong Kong, a typical household needs 16.7 years of its entire income to buy a median home. In Cleveland, Ohio, it takes under 2. Same planet, same advice: stop renting, start buying. So before we repeat the saying, let's ask a sharper question: where and when? You have heard it your whole life. Renting is throwing money away. It gets repeated like a law of physics. But here's the thing about physics: gravity is the same everywhere on Earth. Housing is not. The cost of owning, compared to renting, swings wildly from one city to the next. So a phrase that sounds universal turns out to be deeply local. Economists measure affordability with a simple number called the median multiple. You take the median home price and divide it by the median household income. A multiple of 3 means 3 years of income buys a home. Across major world cities, that number runs from around 2 to nearly 17. That's roughly a 5-fold spread for the exact same thing: a place to live. And don't lose the other end of that spread, because it's the hopeful part. In Cleveland, a median home costs only about 2 years of income. Across much of the American Midwest and places like it, buying still works the way the old advice assumes. The slogan isn't wrong everywhere. It's just wrong in the expensive places that get all the headlines. One quick, important note: everything in this film is historical data about markets. It is not financial advice. We will never tell you to rent, or to buy, or to invest. We are only showing what the numbers have done. With that said, let's map it. Zoom all the way out to whole countries. The OECD tracks how home prices move against incomes on an index where the year 2015 equals 100. Several countries, including Portugal, the Netherlands, and Canada, now sit above 130. That means homes have grown far more expensive relative to incomes than they were a decade ago. The OECD average is around 115. The pressure is real, but it is not evenly spread. And it didn't creep up over a century. It happened on a 10-year clock. Set every country to 100 in 2015 and watch a single decade play out. Portugal climbed to about 138. The Netherlands, 134. Canada, 132. Homes pulled away from paychecks across much of the rich world, fast, and they are still moving. Now narrow back in to a single country. Even inside the United States, the gap is enormous. In San Jose, in Silicon Valley, the median home costs about 11.65 times the median income. Drive to Pittsburgh, and that number falls to about 3. The national figure sits near 5. So should you buy has wildly different answers depending only on which exit you take off the highway. Cross the Atlantic, and the same story repeats. In England, the typical home costs about 7.7 times average earnings, according to the Office for National Statistics. In London, that ratio peaked near 13 in 2021 and has since eased to about 11. So even within one country, the capital plays by completely different rules than everywhere else. Here's where the cliché starts to crack. There's another ratio: price to rent. It compares the cost of buying to the cost of renting the same kind of home. A high number means buying is the expensive option. In Taipei, that ratio is around 80. In Seoul, near 78. In Zurich, around 46. At those levels, renting is often the cheaper deal for years, the exact opposite of throwing money away. In Cleveland, the ratio is under 5, and buying looks far more attractive. Same advice, opposite math. So let's name the places where the slogan flips completely. Measured in years of rent it would take to equal a purchase, Taipei runs near 80, Seoul near 78, Zurich up in the 40s. In markets like these, a renter can pay less than a buyer for decades on end. Throwing money away becomes the buyer's problem, not the renter's, the exact reverse of the saying. So why did this gap open up? For roughly half a century, house prices and incomes mostly rose together. People earned more, homes cost more, and the ratio stayed fairly stable. Then, around the early 2000s, the lines began to separate. Prices kept climbing while incomes lagged behind. That gap, the space between the two lines, is the affordability squeeze, drawn as a picture. The path there was anything but smooth. The OECD's Real House Price Index, adjusted for inflation, climbed through the dot-com years, then crashed hard during the global financial crisis around 2008. It recovered, flattened, and then surged again during the pandemic. Whether buying was smart depended enormously on which year you happened to be standing in. And that climb crested higher than almost anyone alive had seen. Adjusted for inflation, the index touched roughly 134 in 2022, the steepest real level in about 3 decades. Anyone who bought near that line paid a price, in real terms, that no recent generation had to match. The year you were ready turned out to be its own kind of luck. And being ready is not handed out evenly. So far, only about a quarter of Generation Z owns a home. Part of that is simple: they are young, and youth has always owned less. But that is not the whole story, and the next chart shows just how sharply the line now bends with the decade you were born. And here's that line. Homeownership splits hard by generation. About 80% of baby boomers own their home today. For Gen X, it's around 73%. For millennials, about 55%, and for Gen Z, far less again. The generation you were born into shapes the keys you get to hold. So strip out age entirely and compare people at the very same point in life. At 27, only about a third of today's young adults own a home, against roughly 40% of baby boomers at that exact age. Same age, fewer keys. The gap isn't only time passing, it's which era you happen to grow up in. Now, the famous counterargument. If renting is cheaper in your city, you could invest the difference, the money you didn't spend on a mortgage, taxes, and maintenance. Historically, in some markets, the renter who invested that gap built more wealth than the buyer. We're showing one illustrative example here, indexed over time. Read it as a historical pattern in a specific market, not a promise and not advice. The result flips depending on the city, the decade, and the discipline to actually invest the difference. There's a deeper number behind that argument. Over recent decades, a broad U.S. stock index returned roughly 8.4% a year. U.S. home prices rose roughly 6.6% a year. On the surface, stocks win. But this comparison has a giant asterisk. The housing figure ignores leverage. Most buyers put down a fraction and borrow the rest, which magnifies returns. It also ignores rent you'd otherwise pay and the costs of owning. So this is not a clean head-to-head. It's a reminder that the math is more complicated than a slogan. So, is renting throwing money away? Sometimes yes. In a low-price-to-rent city, buying builds equity fast and renting can lag. But sometimes buying is the waste. In a market where a home costs 16 years of income and rents are comparatively cheap, the data gives one honest answer, and it isn't a slogan. It depends on where you are and when you're standing there. The spread is roughly 5-fold across cities, and the index has swung above 130. Geography and timing do most of the work. None of this tells you what to do. It only shows what the numbers have done. Renting isn't automatically waste, and buying isn't automatically wealth. Both are bets on a specific place at a specific time. The data doesn't give advice. It gives context. And in a world this uneven, context is the whole story.